Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our Paving the Way for Responsible Business Conduct in the Decade of Action webinar series. My name is Daria Naglick, and I'm the Senior Manager, Programs and Business Relations here at Global Compact Network Canada. Today's session, Respecting Labor Rights, Business Leaders and the Changing Landscape of Decent Work, will discuss how businesses are upholding labor standards across their operations and supply chains while strengthening their commitments to labor rights and decent work and addressing the impacts of COVID-19. Decent work empowers society and is good for business. Our panelists today will share their experiences and expertise, highlighting some best practices, strong recommendations, and the importance for businesses to prioritize their commitments to creating safe and inclusive workplaces. Introducing our panel for today, we have Ira Thomas, President and CEO of Lucara Diamond, Kevin B. Kuhn, Partner at Baker McKenzie, and Mary Lou Dupont, Senior Manager, Decent Work and Social Sustainability at the United Nations Global Compact. Thank you all for being here with us today. Before we begin our panel discussion, we'd like to open up the discussion with a question for the audience. Please take a moment to open up a new browser and join slido.com, where you can enter this code listed in the chat. The code is R717. I'll give everyone a quick moment to do this. Please note that we are sharing the Slido link and code in the chat box for your reference. We will also be asking a few more questions via Slido throughout the session, so please keep this tab open. Our first question for the audience is, what do you think is the biggest challenge related to decent work and labor in Canada? Please type in your answers and they'll populate the screen here for everyone to see. We'll allow for a few moments and give everyone the opportunity to open up slido.com. And the code is right there, R717. We'd really appreciate it for you to participate. Okay, wonderful. We'll give a couple more seconds to see some of the answers pop up. Okay, we seem to be getting some really good answers. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so we see that there's a lot of priorities for the Canadians out there today. Wonderful. So to begin our discussion, I'd like to start with asking Mary Lou, what are the 4 principles related to labor and why is it integral that businesses meet these standards?
Oh, thank you so much. And I find it so interesting to see the answers from the participants. I recognize many of our priorities in our work here on decent work and labor rights in global supply chain. And I think, well, in decent work and global supply chain. And I think after a full year of lockdown and all measures, family-friendly workplaces, I think all of us can totally relate to that challenge. So I'll go straight into the content of this question before we go to more practical examples from the companies who are on this panel. I'm asked to elaborate a little bit more about the labor principles of the Global Compact. So here we come. Here it comes. We have 10 principles of the Global Compact. If you're familiar with the Global Compact, and welcome to the newcomers if you're not. And 4 of them relate to labor. So labor is quite core to our mission and objectives at the UN Global Compact. These 4 principles on labor derive from the fundamental principles and rights at work, and they cover freedom of association and the recognition of the right to collective bargaining. This is principle 3, relates to elimination of all forms of forced labor, the effective abolition of child labor, and the elimination of discrimination. And this really relates to the workplace or the recruitment context. The labor principles are I would say probably the most specific of our 10 principles, but I mean, that doesn't mean that they are the easiest, I would say, to implement. In fact, the labor rights and the decent work are very often identified by the companies we engage with, and also through the annual survey that we conduct as both either the biggest challenge that companies do face, or the biggest opportunity they have to address their issues and to provide impacts, positive impacts at scale. Here, it's really important for us to mention that the International Labour Organization is the guardian of these principles, and we work really closely with ILO experts, ILO being the abbreviation, to offer guidance to companies on how to integrate these principles in their business operations. Labor rights, even, I would say, it becomes even more apparent in the current context. Labor rights has become quite critical component and a crucial pillar of any human rights due diligence process, and is quite central as well to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Adopting human rights due diligence processes do ensure that companies have a better understanding of who their suppliers are and the risks that they pose, and also allows companies to understand how to address these risks. The other big pillar, I would say, or work stream that we focus on in the UN Global Compact is, of course, decent work for all workers, which is also the focus of Goal 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Respect for workers' rights and compliance with labor standards is really the foundation of decent work. But not only decent work also goes beyond, I would say, a due diligence approach or even a compliance approach. And I could see in the response that you provided, fair wage. I think fair wage is a pretty good example of this idea of going beyond compliance to be able to provide decent work. And obviously, I'm referring to what a minimum wage is versus what a living wage should be. So I'll maybe end this my answer to this question by just giving you an overview of the component of decent work. So I think that might be helpful for the rest of the discussion. This is the definition of the International Labour Organization, and it's very much how we work around decent work and the topic that we focus on. So when we say decent work, we mean, again, fair income, so work that is productive and deliver a fair income. We also mean security, safety and security in the workplace, social protection for families, so another hot topic in the context of the pandemic, better prospect for personal development and social integration, freedom of association, so this whole social dialogue piece, and equal opportunity for all women and men. So the gender component is obviously quite important in the decent work definition. So perhaps I'll stop here to give the chance to the other speakers to also elaborate a little bit more on this topic.
Thank you, Mary Lou, for the great overview and for really setting the stage for the rest of the discussion. Our next question is for Ira. Ira, how has your company embedded or reinforced decent work principles?
Thank you very much. Happy to be involved in this panel talking about all these really important issues. I think for Lucara, it really starts with a strong governance framework, policies and codes that we put in place more than 12 years ago. And just by way of a little background, Lucara is a mid-tier diamond producer whose principal asset is a diamond mine located in north central Botswana. So that is where 98% of our workforce resides, and we're certainly proud of the fact that 98% of our employees actually come from Botswana, and were mostly educated in Botswana as well. So for us, obviously starting with fair wages, and that's something I think that's absolutely underpins everything that we do. And I think in terms of what's interesting about Botswana is that actually in terms of discrimination, I think everyone might find it interesting to know that there is no wage disparity between men and women. And when we first kind of brought this subject up with some of our senior leaders and wanting to talk about our policies and our plans and how we were evolving in this arena, they all looked at us quite perplexed, because the reality is that wage disparity doesn't exist in Botswana, which is a great thing to see. Having said that, we are very focused on trying to advance our female leaders within the organization. I'm really proud to say that, at our board, we're more than 40% women, and at our senior executive level, we are 85% female. So we've made a lot of progress, I think, in that area. And I think one of the key focus areas for us now, as we look at the whole kind of range of opportunities and positions within our workforce, we're really looking to try and increase training and development. I think that's a key focus area for us now. How do we upskill our workforce and migrate people at entry-level positions through the organization and give them increasing opportunities, and really look out along their own individual career paths.
Thank you, Ira. Those are some really great examples. Kevin, I'd also like to ask you the same question. Can you also share some examples with us on how your company has embedded or reinforced decent work principles?
Sure, and thank you for allowing me to be on this panel this afternoon. I'll make my comments from the perspective of a law firm, which has its own challenges, but then also from time to time make comments in terms of the work that I do in the human rights area in terms of dealing with clients. But from a law firm's perspective, the law firm, we focused on the issue of gender. The law business is notoriously bad at equality in the leadership ranks of across the country, actually across the globe. And there's a lot of work to be done. And so one of the things that we've done is we've focused on gender equality, and have done so by embedding an initiative, we call it our 40-40-20, which requires that we have at least 40% women in leadership roles at the highest level. The law business, more than 50% of the new entrants, new lawyers to law firms are women. And at the leadership ranks, at the partner level and the leadership ranks, that number diminishes to less than 10%. And so there's a big issue in terms of retaining talented women through the life cycle of your law career. And so we've made it a priority. We signed on actually as the first global law firm to sign on to the UN Global Compact as a sign of leadership and down into the organization about embracing the broad principles. And so we've put in place a number of measures to ensure that the barriers that women face, in particular, as they advance their career, are reduced or eliminated. A good example is one where we put in place a program where we mentor or buddy up with female lawyers through their career with a senior executive in the firm as well. And that's to allow them to see the issues, address issues, and then provide a range of support mechanisms. And then just from the perspective of other things we can do, you asked about decent work, and of course, forced labor is one of those issues. And we tend to think about forced labor as an issue that doesn't really happen here in Canada or in the Western world, and of course, it is prevalent. And I sit on the board of Covenant House, which is a youth shelter. And one of the big initiatives is dealing with the forced labor and sexual exploitation. And that of course is a big issue in North America, and it's a big issue in Toronto. And so as a law firm, what we're doing is we're providing pro bono legal advice and assistance to Covenant House and for the victims of sexual exploitation. And I use that as an example because there's lots of organizations that need assistance from corporate companies in terms of partnering to address some of these issues. And so if you're thinking about ways from a perspective of your workforce is only in Canada, which our provincial laws provide a framework for many of the issues around wages and conditions of work and social benefits. But there's other issues here in Canada. As Ira pointed out, if your workforce is overseas, then you face a whole host of additional issues. So I think I'll stop there with my comments.
Thank you, Kevin. Those are really great examples, and thank you for highlighting some of Baker McKenzie's priorities. I'd like now to move on to our second Slido question. So we're going to put it on the screen for you here. Please join at slido.com. So the second question is, what do you think companies need to do to strengthen labor rights and decent work? A, ensure fair wages. B, improve policies related to sick days, flex work, vacation, and leaves. C, create more inclusive workplaces and better representation. And D, advocate for stronger corporate governance around labor and decent work. Well, we seem to have a couple of answers coming in. Okay, fantastic. Just a little bit of a lag, I think. Okay, great. We'll give it a couple more seconds to see where the stats finally land. Okay, thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts with us. So building on these responses, I'd like to start with you, Kevin, this time. How did COVID-19 impact your company's understanding of labor and decent work? And what are some steps that you have taken to build resiliency and mitigate these risks in the future?
Well, COVID certainly has highlighted many of those issues that came up as priorities on the Slido, particularly around fair wages, sick day policies, and flexibility at work. And so, from the perspective, from our perspective as a law firm, but then also looking out into our corporate clients that face exactly the same issues around, how do you maintain your connection with your workforce now? What are the support mechanisms that you can put in place around mental health issues, mentorship, flexible work hours, and what will the new world of work look like in terms of people reporting to an office 5 days a week or a workplace 5 days a week. Prior to COVID, a lot of companies were thinking about should there be more flexible work or remote work activities, and a lot of companies were taking baby steps in that direction and feared sort of, could they do it? Would it affect productivity? How would it all work? And of course, COVID forced the issue. So everybody's been working remotely. By and large, most people have been working remotely. And so the question now is, what will the world look like going back? And it's a great question. The debate around sick time, who pays for that, time off, that plays itself out on the national level and the provincial level, as we've seen, as provinces, the feds do one thing, the provinces do and want to do another thing. Who pays for that? Our system of the federal government and with the provinces having jurisdiction over labor employment, of course, complicates that discussion. But nevertheless, it has focused the issue for employers as to thinking about and how do you deal with it.
Oh, I didn't realize I was muted. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for sharing some of those examples from Baker McKenzie. To Ira, I will ask the same question. Can you also share with us, how did COVID-19 impact your company's understanding of labor and decent work? And what are some steps that you have taken to build resiliency and mitigate these risks in the future?
Sure. Listen, for us, it's a little bit different. I mean, it certainly has been a challenging period. Early on, mining was declared an essential service in the country of Botswana. So our operations really have continued unabated throughout the pandemic. We did implement a crisis management plan very early, which really focused on how to keep our workforce safe. Obviously, when you're running a mine, we don't have the option of sending everybody home to work remotely. So we really had to manage the number of shifts coming in and out of our operations. We were very focused on hygiene, social distancing, and implementing a bunch of policies to make sure we were keeping our workforce safe. So early on, I think there was obviously a lot of nervousness amongst our employees. They were worried about whether or not they were going to be able to keep their jobs, whether we were going to be successful in working through COVID, and they were worried about getting COVID. So to Kevin's comment about mental health, I have to say, I think that's one of the most important things we've really had to address, and we have made available to all of our employees ongoing counseling, people to talk to, just to try and get comfortable. A year into it now, certainly things have settled down. We've been able to provide assurance to our employees that we can operate safely. Our COVID cases are tracking well below the national average, which is comforting. But it's also taught us a lot, how we can work with fewer people and how to manage certain aspects of our business working remotely, and that's been really helpful as well. So I think we've learned that we can be quite resilient. We've learned that there are lots of innovative ways to be productive. And I think that, what our employees have really appreciated through this period as well is that, we have not retrenched anyone through COVID. We've been able to keep our operations going. It's been a challenging time for the market, but I think, everyone has really kind of banded together and taken on that challenge. So we feel we made good progress. I think probably, the one other comment I would make is that our operation in and of itself has been fine, but obviously what's really important to any business is really, how the community around you is faring as well. And of course, that has probably been our biggest challenge, what is happening with our employees' families and their communities. And we've seen, incredible challenges around gender-based violence, for example. So we've really, I think, tried to spend a lot of time listening to our communities of interest and focusing our COVID relief efforts, not just internally on what we're doing within our own operation, but out in the community and what we can do to assist and support and make sure that these communities get through the pandemic and ultimately have the support that they need as well. Maybe I'll pause there.
Deirdre, I just want to pick up on that because that's a
Sure.
very important comment.
No problem.
Ari's business she talks about our community because they're a mining operation and how important that is. But that same principle applies to companies that have supply chains. Because what COVID has done, of course, is the issues that we face here in Canada are exaggerated by a multiple in different parts of the world through supply chain and depending on the nature of the business. And so when we talk about resiliency of a company, part of that resiliency relates to the resiliency of their supply chain. So that when COVID is over, there's some normalcy of business, is that they've got sustainable, resilient supply chains. And so efforts need to be done now in terms of supporting those supply chains in the same way in which Lucara is supporting the communities in which they operate. It's the same underlying principle. And depending on the sector, certain supply chain communities have been very hard hit. The commodities business, anybody in the commodities business, apparel and others. And so there's lots of examples where companies are reaching very deep into their supply chain to provide the supports that are necessary to ensure in some measure that those supply chains are as operational and receiving the support they need for the overall resilience of the company in the longer term.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin, for those added points. And thank you, Ira. Those are some excellent steps that your organization is taking. I'd like to shift a little bit now to Mary Lou. Mary Lou, can you tell us what are some other initiatives that the UN Global Compact has created to help companies advance the principles of decent work?
Yeah, it will be my pleasure. So I'd like to maybe give you two examples of a work stream that we have around these topics. In 2017, back in 2017, we launched a number of what we call action platforms on a number of topics related to the advancement of the Sustainable Development Goals, with the idea of bringing together companies from different sectors and of different size as well. Some of our global compact networks, such as the one that is organizing this webinar today, we do have about 69 or maybe even 70 now local networks around the world. Just as a piece of information, and also other stakeholders and partners to discuss shared objectives, again, to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and to address some of the most pressing challenges that we discussed a bit today. And one of these platforms is on decent work in global supply chain. So decent work, again, is quite a broad topic, and since 2017 we've had a chance to look at different angles based on what the companies themselves identified as the most important challenges that they faced. The way we organize our work is really to develop best practices, actions based on actions that are taken by companies and others, and to share these best practices to educate, to inspire other companies. Everything we do is completely public. Of course, we don't invite necessarily external participants or external companies in meetings, but everything we develop is completely and totally free and accessible for everyone. Really, with this idea that everyone benefits from a level playing field and a better understanding of what are the expectations on sustainability, on human rights, on labor rights, on decent work, and all these other important topics are well understood by all companies, so that companies who are leading on sustainability are not disadvantaged when they operate in certain contexts, because they are providing better conditions, they are providing, or they are implementing better practices. Now, as an example of the very first challenge that the companies themselves, and I mean, this is all public, so I'm happy to share who is part of it, but just to give you an example of the type of companies who is involved in the platform. I mean, we're talking about Unilever, for example, Relic, Shell, Total, Pirelli, UPM, SAP, Ariba. So companies that are quite different, but for most part are really big, with extensive supply chains in a large number of countries. And the very first challenge that was identified by all these companies, and the very first focus of our work in the action platform, was procurement. So how do companies ensure that the objectives on sustainability can be applied to the procurement practice? How can decent work, how can human rights, how can labor rights can be integrated into decision-making, procurement decision-making, daily practices? How do you lift some of the pressure that relates to finding the cheapest possible price large diversification of suppliers on which you have very little leverage to implement best practices, deadlines, lead times, and all these things, operating in weak governance countries, all these issues that obviously procurement colleagues have to deal with on a daily basis. What can you do to ensure that some of this pressure is lifted, and that procurement colleagues do have first an understanding of their role in scaling up best practices through the choice of their suppliers, through their engagement with the suppliers, and through their own decision making on sourcing, and how procurement colleagues can also train suppliers so that you have that cascading effect in supply chains. And we spent about 2 years on this very specific topic, and developed the Decent Work Toolkit for Sustainable Procurement, and organized a large number of dialogue. And now, after 2 years and a half of really focusing on decent work more broadly and the engagement with suppliers, we are shifting our attention to another very important topic. We are looking at the root cause for decent work deficits, working poverty, or I should say, one of the root cause for decent work deficit, working poverty, and the focus of our work is right now on living wage, on fair wage or decent wage. And we've been developing, with the support and inputs of our participants in the action platform, guidance on how companies can, first of all, have their own house in order, right? So obviously, I don't think it would be the right approach to start working on living wage through your supply chains if you're not a living wage employer. So looking at how you can transform, adapt, develop HR practices and processes to ensure you do, in fact, provide living wage yourself in your own workforce, no matter where you operate. And then looking at what it means to have living wage, or to promote and advance living wage in your supply chain, knowing that you are not the primary, or you're not the employer yourself. So the role is obviously here a bit different. But I would say I think I share a lot of your thinking around wage. I really do believe that decent work, or wage, the wages that are provided to workers is a very central element of decent work, and it has been overlooked as probably because it is a very challenging issue, but at the end of the day, it is the source of so many of the other human rights, labor rights, and decent work issues that I think we can no longer just put aside the issue of the wages that are provided to workers to focus on other issues that might be a bit more manageable. I think there is a momentum right now, which in part was created by the pandemic, which in a way forces us to look at this bigger problem of wages, informal work, legal arrangements, and all these things. The other example that I wanted to provide is our work around child labor. So I told you earlier that we work really closely with the International Labour Organization. This year is the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. Not to say that obviously it's not important the other years, but it is one of the big priorities for the Secretary General. The numbers which will be published by the ILO on child labor a year now into the pandemic are going to be absolutely catastrophic. Children are being forced back. 30 years of progress on child labor are being completely swept out. I'm not sure I have the right English expression here, but I think you get my point. So it is a very pressing issue, and there is again a need to step up efforts on this. So we are supporting the ILO on this. The ILO is asking, or has been asking, companies, governments, stakeholders to pledge, to submit pledges to the ILO on how they can eliminate child labor within this year. Obviously, the idea is obviously not to promise that child labor is going to be eliminated this year, but what type of action can you actually start this year to eliminate child labor can you pledge to do? And we ourselves, as UN Global Compact, have made the pledge to encourage our companies to make their own pledge with a focus on human rights due diligence. And we organized a number of different activities, and we'll have a pretty big event organized with the ILO on child labor as well as living wage during the Leaders Summit, which we are organizing this June 15 and 16. For all UN Global Compact participants, this you can subscribe. You can attend these 2 days events, which will cover a very large number of topics. So maybe I'll stop here. I feel like I probably spoke too much, but these are two examples of how we work, how we partner. Partnership is obviously a very key way we work at the Global Compact on topics related to decent work, to labor rights and human rights in general.
Thank you for sharing, Mary Lou, and really happy to hear all of the incredible work being done by you and your team at the UN Global Compact. So thank you for sharing. So I'd like to ask everyone to visit their Slido tab once more for our third and final audience question. The question is, does your company have a policy in place to ensure labor rights in supply chains? We'll just give a few more minutes for the answers to populate. Okay, thank you everyone for your responses. Oh, they're still coming in. Fantastic. Okay, thank you. I'd like to address the next question to Ira. Ira, what is one practical action or recommendation that you would give to a company looking to learn more about decent work or to strengthen their labor policies and practices?
Thank you, Daria. And I really just want to make a quick comment on what Mary Lou said, because I think it's obviously so critical, those two key areas of focus, particularly coming out of the pandemic, which has been really challenging. I've spent, the last 3 months in the southern part of Africa, mostly Botswana, but also a little bit in South Africa. And you can really see the pressure that these countries are under right now through the pandemic, and in terms of business resiliency and just the maintenance of jobs, period. So it is a very challenging time. I think for Lucara, what we have really I think doubled down on in terms of our efforts in the last couple of years has been around living wages and what that really means to our organization. We are fortunate to be working in Botswana, which is often considered referred to as the Switzerland of Africa. It's generally quite a wealthy country by African standards. There is access to infrastructure and education and healthcare, which certainly makes our jobs easier. But I think what we've really noticed is that we've done a pretty good job of educating our leaders, and as I mentioned before, we have mostly Botswanans. We're 98% Botswanan, and our managing director of the mine is the first female managing director of any mine in Botswana. But I think where we've really focused our lens in the last while, and the recommendation is, I think you can get complacent as an organization when you start achieving some success in these areas, particularly at senior levels, whether it's women on board or Botswana participation. What we've really done now is gone back to look at that specific issue around living wage. Yes, we believe we're achieving that, and we certainly do have policies to ensure that labor rights are protected throughout our supply chains. But I think what we've noticed is that while we may be achieving a living wage, there's not a lot of movement with those employees in that segment of our workforce. And so we are really focused on training and the opportunity to migrate some of those employees into better opportunities that will take them now beyond a living wage. And I think that for us is going to be a key focus area. We've had a couple of high potential employees, for example, one who came to us as a general laborer or handyman that we were ultimately able to retrain over the last couple of years to now be a crane operator on the site, which is a significant increase in wages for him. We've also had, one of our cleaning women on the site that has now been retrained as a health and safety officer. So these are the types of things that we're really focused on as a small company, kind of looking at what we can do within our workforce. We have made some good progress, but when we start to really think about the breadth of the positions that we have, and again to the supply chain, this is where we can really lead by example in demonstrating that we want to really ensure that we are creating not only a decent work environment and an equitable work environment where everyone feels valued, but one where there really is opportunity. And I think that is that's critical for us. And so, obviously it's important to get there on the living wage, but I think, we have to go beyond. We have to think about where your organization needs to be in the short, medium, and long term. And there's still a lot to do, certainly, from our perspective, to really make a difference with our employees and our communities of interest. So maybe I'll pause there for a moment.
Thank you, Ira, for your thoughts and recommendations. Yes, Kevin, can you also share with us one practical action or recommendation that you would like to give to a company looking to learn more about decent work or to strengthen their labor policies and practices?
Sure, I'm glad to do that. But before I do that, I just want to make a comment about how valuable to have Ira's comments, particularly given the unique nature of the business, where, as she indicated, she's a Canadian-based company in the mining sector, and which is a big important sector for the Canadian economy. But 98% of our workforce is in Botswana on the ground. And so all of these issues that we're talking about, she's dealing with on a daily basis, and almost entirely the focus. And so it's a great perspective to have. And we often, in these types of panels, don't necessarily have that. So I'm certainly grateful, and I hope our participants are grateful as well. But the comment I would make about this in terms of decent work is really go back to some first principles about how every company can think about these issues and address them, and go back to the due diligence that Mary Lou mentioned. The human right, thinking about this from a due diligence perspective, including incorporating human rights principles within your due diligence, and then into your enterprise risk management systems. And so, the UN guiding principles are based on a due diligence model, and due diligence being, hey, what is the circumstances that each employer faces? And so if you're a company that is provincially regulated, your workforce is only in your province, then you look at that with a human rights lens as well as other lens and say, what are our circumstances? And so where is our risk? Is it with regards to local discrimination issues? Is it regards to freedom of association issues in terms of union issues? However, if the answer is, hey, what are our circumstances as start of this due diligence process, is we have 3 plants around the globe, or sources, and we have a supply chain where we're sourcing from China on certain goods. And then you ask yourself, then where are we doing business? What's the nature of our business? What's our supply chain? And that's going to identify certain risks around human rights issues. And it's well known that in certain jurisdictions, forced labor issues are prevalent. There's a lot of focus on China these days in terms of the Uyghurs and Xinjiang province as to goods being sourced from there. Canada just passed a law, as did the United States and Mexico very soon, of prohibiting the importation of goods made with forced labor. And that's impacted many regions around the globe. And it's impacted personal protective equipment, for example, in terms of coming into Canada, coming into the United States. And so those are the kind of risks you need to think about as a company. So go back to first principles around due diligence. What are our circumstances? The circumstances that the company is in, including where they're doing business, how they're organized, multiple countries, what the supply chain is going to dictate some of the measures that you need to think about in terms of from a human rights perspective, including the decent work and other principles under the UN Global Compact. And so that's where I would say you need to think about, and that will address some of those issues and weaknesses and gaps that you will find throughout the organization.
Thank you, Kevin, for sharing your reflections and recommendations. Okay, so Mary Lou, just one more question for you. What is one practical action or recommendation that you would give to the business community to help strengthen labor policies and practices?
Yes, well, I think I could not agree more with what I just heard from Kevin, right? So human rights due diligence is really the way companies can understand their supply chains, their impacts, their suppliers, and how to address these impacts. So I really have nothing to add. Maybe just to say that, if you look at the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and also what we heard already about human rights due diligence, kind of seems like simple on paper, but the truth is that for most, if not all companies, this is a challenging, this is a really challenging process. If you look at companies who have hundreds of thousands of suppliers, for example, just tier 1, you can imagine the amount of these challenges that you have to assess, and the amount of suppliers that you have to better understand. Just the mapping in itself, just the mapping of your suppliers will take a lot of your time. And so I think it's not realistic to think that companies themselves alone can act on these impacts. I think this notion of partnerships, this notion of sharing best practices, sharing challenges, getting together to increase leverage at the industry level, at the country level, I think it is really key to make impacts at scale and to move the needle on a number of these issues. I'm just thinking about, for example, if you look at the garment sector, the reality of the way this particular sector is organized and how the supply chain looks like, is that a company will have a very tiny portion of the production of garment factories, for example. So looking at how you can increase health and safety in the workplace, for example, looking at how you can ensure that you don't have overtime, or at least no excessive overtime, looking at family-friendly policies, for example, knowing that most of your workers, or most of these workers, are women. So how do you ensure that you have policies that ensure women can send or can have access to a structure of daycare, for example, that women can breastfeed their children, knowing that breastfeeding in many contexts is, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but is a difference between being healthy and not so healthy for many children. So all these considerations, living wage, you have to work as a group in a way to influence at large, to have, again, some leverage, to make impact. It is important to converge, to share, to exchange best practices, to engage with with the different stakeholders that can enable decent work to happen. So partnership, getting together with other companies, engaging with civil society organizations on the ground, those who really do understand the context in which your workers are in, workers, representatives. I think engagement, partnerships, cooperation, coordination is what my recommendation will be for the audience today.
Thank you so much, Mary Lou. I really appreciate that. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to pose this question to Ira and Kevin. What makes you hopeful about the future of decent work and labor standards? So Ira, if you'd like to go first.
Listen, I think what makes me hopeful is when you see how all of these subjects has been elevated by the work of the UN Global Compact and companies that are signing on and contributing to the SDGs and creating a more transparent reporting mechanism. I think that really helps, to Mary Lou's point about trying to get that coordination. And to me, it's all about increasing transparency and having the forum to be able to open up and talk about these issues. I think never before have we seen so much interest. I think that is what's going to drive the change, is that we are getting larger buy-in, not only by the companies and the organizations that are signatories to these various initiatives, but by the broader public at large. And I think that it's becoming clear to organizations that this is not just a nice thing to work towards, that it's essential to creating a sustainable business and a successful sustainable business too. I think that message is becoming is being delivered now, I think, in a way that we haven't seen in the past. It doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go. I think we're at the start of this journey. I think we're just beginning to understand what all the opportunities could be. But I think the fact that we are having forums like this, and where there is an exchange of experiences, and there is interest from a broad audience to learn more, this is where it all begins in my mind. And I think that we can be hopeful about that. Lots to do, but certainly I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you so much. Kevin?
Yeah, sure. But before I do that, I'm going to go back to the previous question really briefly, because you asked how can companies learn about these work? Some simple things, and one, of course, would be to join on to the Canadian chapter of the Global Compact Network that's hosting this meeting. Is very robust, is very active, and is a great source of information, but also networking and partnership that Mary Lou talked about. So that's a real simple way as for those companies that are just starting this journey. But turning to the other part in terms of optimism, I think there is a reason for optimism. And just to pick up on what Ira was saying, is if you look at the trend over the last few years as to the discussion around ESG and its importance, environmental, social, and governance issues, and you go back 18 months to the U.S. Business Council, that made a very fundamental shift in thinking as to the role of the corporation. And for the last 40 plus years, following the declaration from Milton Friedman around, corporations serve the shareholders' interests only. Very fundamental shift 2 years ago, where they made a statement to say that it's about the stakeholders. and not simply to shareholders, which opens up, of course, a whole range of considerations broader than just what's the value for the shareholder and to the stakeholders. And that may mean communities that they operate in, and a whole range of issues related to ESG. A very, very important shift. And then that, followed that by the statements from BlackRock, largest manager of assets, about valuing companies and looking at companies from the perspective of just not shareholder value, but the issues dealing with ESG. Again, a very fundamental shift. And then you're seeing companies re-examining. Let me just back up. The Edelman Trust Barometer that comes out on a yearly basis, if you track that over the last couple of years, one of the number one decisions that consumers are making about the decisions to buy brands is the trust. And they affiliate trust with what are companies doing in their communities, what are they doing in the supply chain. And so, companies looking at that are saying, okay, how do we shift in terms of deal with these issues beyond just simply shareholder value or maximum profit? And so there's a shift taking place on many different levels that is driving this agenda. And then Ira, of course, pointed out in terms of how do you have a sustainable business. And so if you look at examples like Unilever 10 years ago, where they started to incorporate principles around sustainability within their business function. And because they realized as a commodity-based business that they needed a reliable supply, a cocoa supplier, a sugar supplier, a palm oil supplier, if they were going to be a successful business in the long run. And so it was in their interest to have quality commodity products. And so what did that mean for them? That meant that they needed to get as deep down as they could into their supply chain to make sure that those suppliers were producing top quality, that were earning a living wage, that were a reliable supply chain. And a number of companies are now looking at that from the same perspective, spending tens of millions of dollars. And then the other issue that doesn't get talked a lot about, but I think it's equally important as a factor, is that up until about until the advent of the UN Global Compact 11 years ago now, the UN thought that they could go it alone in the sense of driving development change in the globe. And then there's been a fundamental shift at the UN that they need partnerships, that they need the resources, the logistics, the intellectual power of partnering with the business community to achieve the goals. And so with the launch of sustainable development goals, there was a recognition, a broad recognition of that. And so you've seen, the various different arms of the UN. The UN Global Compact was the leader, but then you have, the UNDP and the other agencies also looking to partnership where with corporations, where in the past that was kind of a taboo thing to do. And so you're seeing a real convergence on a number of levels that is really driving change and fundamental change. COVID has highlighted that in many respects about the vulnerability of supply chains. And so I'm optimistic about that in terms of for the future.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Ira, for your inspiring words today. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We've come to the conclusion of our webinar. Thank you also to our wonderful panelists for your time today and your continued efforts in working to build safe and inclusive workplaces. We'd also like to invite everyone to attend our next session in the series, which will be refocusing the decade of delivery and how businesses can drive ambitious corporate climate action, which will be hosted on June 10th. We look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and thank you to our panelists and everyone who was able to join us today. Have a wonderful day, everyone.